Hello! Today we're diving into the curious and sometimes creepy world of hygiene during the Victorian era. Did you know that many people shared the same bathtub filled with dirty water and that it was completely normal? After this video, you'll be grateful for having hot water and soap all to yourself. If you enjoy uncovering quirky facts from the past, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and get comfortable, because it's time for a story I know will help you fall asleep. Imagine this. You step outside your crowded London terrace home and take a breath, only to regret it instantly. The air doesn't just smell bad, it feels wrong, thick and heavy, like it's clinging to your skin and settling in your lungs. Coal fires churn out smoke in every direction, blanketing the city in a dull haze. Horses trot by, leaving their manure behind in steaming, foul piles. Somewhere nearby, someone has just dumped a bucket of waste into the gutter, and it's making its slow, grim journey down the street. Rotting food scraps line the edges of the road, flies picking at them languidly. And yet, this was normal. You may not have even noticed the stench anymore, but it wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous, and people knew it. Now, take a moment to think about what that meant for day-to-day life. The air was more than just a bad smell. It felt alive, almost sticky, settling into your clothes and your hair. When you came home after a walk through the city, traces of the streets followed you back indoors. Shoes carried in mud and worse, often tracked straight across a shared hallway floor. The invisible weight of the smoke and waste in the air lingered even after you thought you'd escaped it. Washing it off wasn't always practical or even possible, especially if you didn't have access to proper facilities. Instead, people turned to simpler solutions, like spritzing their handkerchiefs with scented water to press over their noses while walking around. Or they used perfume, not so much as a mark of elegance, but as a desperate armor against the smells that assaulted them from every street corner. You might wonder if anyone complained. The truth is, they often did. Writers, journalists, and residents occasionally expressed their disgust with vivid descriptions of the offensive city air. But what could they really do about it? The city had swelled so quickly, with people flooding in from rural areas, that the infrastructure needed to handle all the waste and pollution simply didn't exist. And those in charge of the city's operations, if they weren't themselves wealthy enough to simply avoid the worst of it, didn't fully understand the implications of the foul-smelling air hanging over London. Here's where things start to take a darker turn. You see, those smells, as disgusting as they were, didn't just hint at the obvious. Spilled contents of chamber pots, decomposing bodies of dead animals in the street, or stagnant puddles of grease and grime. They were also believed to carry death in their thick haze. This was the era of miasma theory. Doctors, scientists, and most regular people truly believed that diseases like cholera, typhoid, and others were carried through the air itself, spreading sickness to anyone who had the misfortune of breathing in the fetid gases rising from decomposing matter. Disease seemed to follow the smell wherever it went, and in the absence of any better understanding, how could they not conclude that it was at fault? It's easy to forget how heavy the belief in miasma really was. Imagine opening your window to catch a breeze, only to panic that a draft carried with it the seeds of illness. In some households, airing out rooms was avoided altogether, out of fear they were inviting sickness indoors. Others focused on masking the danger, not eliminating it. Sweet-smelling herbs and flowers were positioned in rooms to overpower any unpleasant scents, and burning incense or other fragrant materials became a way to cleanse, or at least so people thought, the air of deadly particles. Even public spaces took note. In wealthier parts of town, streets might be lightly sprayed with scented solutions during festive events, a futile but well-meaning attempt to battle the invisible threat of disease. The smells weren't uniform city-wide, of course. Different areas, depending on their trade or local habits, had their own distinctive stinks. Textile mills filled neighborhoods with chemical tangs from dyes, while meatpacking districts reeked of blood and offal. The worst areas were often the poorest, where overcrowding made matters worse. Tenement buildings packed families into 1 or 2 rooms and shared latrines that might serve dozens of households. These privies were as much sources of foul air as the open sewers themselves. Without proper disposal, there was nowhere else to put the waste piling up in stagnant pools. During rainstorms, any established order broke down further as cesspits overflowed into the streets, sending a riot of smells up through every neighborhood. For those who could afford to flee the city on occasion, the idea of escaping to clean air wasn't a simple luxury. It was considered a necessity. Doctors prescribed sea breezes and rural air as remedies for various ailments they attributed to bad smells. Families who could spare both time and money fled regularly for weeks or even months, seeking refuge in less polluted parts of the country or along the coast. But for most Londoners, this just wasn't an option. They had to live amidst the nastiness and make the best of it.
So why did it smell like this, really? The obvious answer comes down to waste and pollution. Coal was, of course, the prime offender. Every heating fire and industrial chimney spewed smoke into the narrow streets and alleyways, choking the life out of fresh air before it could even circulate. Horses, which were essential for transportation of both people and goods, came with the endless byproduct of manure. Hundreds of thousands of animals trudged their routes daily through the cobblestone streets, leaving a trail behind them that no one had figured out how to remove efficiently. Add to that the lack of organised garbage collection systems, people simply discarded things they didn't need into the road, and the city began to resemble an overwhelming collage of filth. It didn't help that sanitation was an afterthought at best, completely absent at worst. The layout of the city was chaotic. Many streets were narrow and haphazardly connected, forming tight, closed-off spaces that didn't allow odours or smoke to dissipate. And lingering in all of this was the Thames itself, London's lifeline and dumping ground at the same time. Waste, domestic, industrial, human, ended up in the river, transforming it into an open sewer and giving the city an aroma that seemed to rise from the water itself, particularly during warmer months when evaporation amplified the stink. Despite this, the overwhelming filth gave rise to some creative solutions, however ineffective they ultimately proved to be. The city began experimenting with methods to clean things up on a larger scale, though most of them revolved not around actual removal of harmful waste, but on minimising its visible and olfactory effects. For example, lime was sometimes spread in certain areas to reduce both the smell and the threat of miasma. City workers occasionally carted manure to farms outside of town, though this process wasn't frequent enough to make a real dent in the issue. At the heart of all of this was a dangerous misunderstanding. The dominant belief in miasma meant that while people recognised an association between bad smells and poor health, they didn't understand what the air was actually carrying, or, more importantly, what it wasn't. Public health efforts remained focused on managing odours, rather than attacking the sources of disease itself, which would have required completely reimagining how waste was handled in the city. This isn't to say that Londoners were entirely powerless. By this time, organised departments were beginning to discuss how to tackle the larger waste problem, but the process moved slowly, bogged down by limited knowledge and resistance from those who would foot the bill for improvements. In the meantime, people tried their best to convince themselves that minor personal habits, like keeping fresh flowers indoors or taking occasional trips to the outskirts of the city, would be enough to protect them from whatever illness the air carried. That belief, faulty as it was, shaped public health strategies through the mid-19th century. Miasma theory dominated medical thinking so completely that even some of the strangest suggestions, like building tall vents to release bad air away from homes, were taken seriously by planners and physicians alike. Of course, all the perfumes and burning herbs in the world wouldn't eliminate diseases like cholera or typhoid, but as long as the air was blamed, the real culprits, infected water, poor sanitation, and contaminated food, continued unchecked. And so the stink remained a constant companion to the people of London, with miasma hanging over them in both metaphorical and literal ways. But if bad air was seen as the enemy, where exactly was it all coming from? That's where we head next. The streets were rivers of filth. Picture this.
You're standing on a busy Victorian London street, and every step forward lands you deeper into filth. Around you, people toss whatever they don't want, leftover scraps from last night's dinner, broken bits of furniture, spoiled food, and that's just the start. Chamber pots, brimming with human waste, are routinely dumped out of windows or down into the gutters. Maybe someone yells, "Watch out," before hurling the contents, but probably not. Dead animals lie in the road, rotting away in the open air. The sheer volume of trash would be overwhelming enough, but what really topped it all off was the smell, deep, sour, rotten, and impossible to avoid. No one thought twice about throwing things into the street. Where else would it go? There wasn't a system for waste collection, no scheduled cleanup crews, no bins to fill. The idea of organized garbage disposal didn't exist yet. If your pile of waste got too big, someone might toss a little dirt or sawdust on top to mask it, but that was only temporary. Those who were lucky enough to have privies, shared toilets outside, weren't much better off. These privies would fill quickly and overflow, particularly in the rain, when cesspits transformed into pools of sloshing, revolting messes. Rainwater didn't wash things away so much as it spread the filth further down the road. And yet, life carried on. In fact, most families shared their already cramped homes with 4, 5 or more other households, leaving everyone to make do with the waste generated by a staggering number of people in a single small area. Now picture what that meant for the streets. Dirty puddles clung to cobblestones and carts bumped along trails of slimy muck. The sound was as unpleasant as the sight, mud sucking on boots, wheels splashing through stagnant pools of wastewater, and an endless clinking of horse hooves against the pavement, each step accompanied by another fresh pile of manure. This chaotic system, or lack of one, did have a slight remedy, in the form of night soil men. If you haven't heard of them before, their job was as grim as it sounds. They would head out into the streets, well after dark, and empty the waste from cesspools and shared privies. The work was considered so disgusting that it could only be done at night, out of sight of polite society. These men would shovel and haul human waste into large wooden carts, then take it out of the more populated areas of the city. But where did it all go? Into the Thames, of course. The river, then as now, was central to London life. A lifeline, a transportation route, and for some, even a source of drinking water. And yet, it was also treated as a dumping ground on a massive scale. Every night, night soil men added to its rising tide of filth. Beyond that, people threw whatever they could into the water. Rotting vegetables, scrap materials, anything they didn't want clogging their streets or homes. For a city that depended so heavily on its river, this pollution made it dangerous in ways people didn't yet understand. Imagine water drawn from a stream surrounded by open sewers, then used for cooking or drinking. It's no wonder diseases like cholera ran rampant in these conditions. The Thames didn't just silently carry all this waste away. It became a highly visible cesspool. In places where the water ran slower and the summer heat intensified, sewage fermented near the surface, darkening the river's edges and creating an ever-present stink that wafted across the city. Locals near the banks might glaze over in disgust at its appearance. But what else could they do? They couldn't stop its grim transformation into London's unofficial sewer. In the meantime, rainfall brought its own disasters. A heavy storm could turn cesspits into bubbling fountains of filth, spilling human waste and untreated sewage onto the alleys and streets. Neighbours watched as their roads transformed into awful rivers, carrying disease-laden muck straight through marketplaces, doorways and courtyards. By morning, the waters might recede, but what they left behind, heaps of wet, reeking refuse, baked brown under the sun, meant stepping outside came with great risk to both your senses and your health.
This environment wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly, fueling outbreaks of diseases like cholera and typhoid that swept through neighbourhoods without regard for class or wealth. Although the poorest areas bore the worst of it, the contamination of water supplies ensured that no one was truly safe. Each outbreak of cholera brought panic and confusion, with families falling ill in a matter of hours. Entire sections of the population lived in constant fear, watching loved ones succumb to symptoms they couldn't explain or cure.
While miasma theory convinced most people the smells themselves caused disease, the reality was much harder to see. The water they drank and used was spreading illness with terrifying efficiency. Still, the city found ways to function. Horses, those significant contributors to the waste problem, remained critical for transportation and commerce. Each one of London's thousands of horses produced as much as 35 pounds of manure a day, and someone had to clear it. Street sweepers worked tirelessly, pushing back the accumulating piles just to keep the roads passable. But no matter how many times the streets were cleaned, more waste piled up. Meanwhile, the middle and upper classes had servants to manage some of the waste directly inside their homes, with hired hands disposing of chamber pot contents. For the lower classes, the streets were the only available option, a living, breathing landfill that they were trapped inside. The situation worsened as London's population exploded throughout the 19th century. By the 1850s, the city was home to millions, many of whom lived clustered in overcrowded tenements with nowhere to comfortably dispose of even daily waste. The rich and poor alike relied on the Thames, though in vastly different ways. Wealthier areas were often spared the worst direct effects of poor sanitation, either by distance or by design, while other parts of the city were battered by every consequence of London's ever-growing filth. Take a moment to consider how normalised that must have been. People passed carts piled high with refuse as they walked through narrow streets, occasionally covering their noses or holding a perfumed handkerchief to their faces. But larger efforts to deal with the sanitation crisis were slow, partially because the miasma theory remained firmly rooted in public health policies. If the smell of the air was to blame for sickness, many believed, then the water must have been a lesser concern. The interplay between water and waste, however, couldn't be ignored completely. As conditions along the Thames grew worse, even Parliament began noticing the scale of the disaster unfolding in its backyard. Politicians debated, scientists argued, but time ticked on, and the piles of waste grew higher, scattering their foul traces not just over the streets, but into people's lives.
You might be thinking, how did the city even survive with things this bad? The reality is, life was never guaranteed. For families who scraped by on meagre incomes, a sudden illness could spell catastrophe, and with so many living in such close quarters, sickness could spread rapidly before anyone could take action. The streets themselves reflected the precariousness of life, each puddle and pile of trash a risk waiting to be stepped into, both literally and figuratively.
I'm like some on the Soul, Ledge or 5.
Looking back, the Thames was both the city's greatest resource and its worst enemy. It watered crops downstream, gave life to markets and trade, yet also bore the brunt of every desperate attempt to manage waste. But as we'll see next, the problem wasn't confined to the streets or the river. The filth had a way of following people into their homes, making personal hygiene itself an ongoing battle of desperation and innovation. Once a week, if you were lucky. How long could you go without a bath? For many Victorians, the honest answer was weeks. For some, it was even longer. In fact, the idea of full body washing every day would have seemed absurd back then. Not just because it was inconvenient, but because it was widely believed that too much bathing could actually make you sick. At the time, people thought excessive exposure to water could weaken your constitution and leave you more vulnerable to illness, so baths were reserved for special occasions or avoided entirely. Instead, most people relied on sponge baths, wiping down key areas like their face, hands, armpits, and, well, let's just say, the naughty bits. This method was practical, especially in poor households where filling a tub with water would have been a major effort. Think about it. Heating water on a stove or over a fire, carrying it to the washing area, and then cleaning up afterward wasn't something you'd want to do every day. Even wealthy families who had copper tubs and servants to handle the labour wouldn't bathe daily. For them,
twice a week might have been considered frequent. But for the working class, once a week, if that, was the most realistic option, assuming they even had a bathtub or access to enough water. In many homes, especially in overcrowded tenements, there wasn't space for a full bath. Sponge baths were as good as it got. And then there was the issue of soap. For wealthy Victorians, soap wasn't just about cleaning, it was about showing off. Scented soaps, beautifully packaged, were considered status symbols, little luxuries that showed you had the money to afford not just cleanliness, but the sweet-smelling kind. For the working class, though, soap was a costly item, and the cheaper versions they could afford were often harsh and unpleasant to use. Even when you got your hands on some, you weren't about to waste it. Soap was often rationed carefully, used sparingly, and in some cases skipped altogether. If you lived in a wealthy home, your morning routine probably included a washstand in your bedroom, a little wooden or metal table topped with porcelain basins, a pitcher of water, and maybe even a bottle of rose water if you wanted to freshen up a bit. You might give yourself a quick clean, but even then it wasn't a long, luxurious process. Heating water took time even if you had servants to do it for you, and nobody wanted to go through all that effort unless it was absolutely necessary. Plus, with the belief that too much washing was unhealthy, many people genuinely saw bathing sparingly as a smarter, healthier option. For the working class, however, things were very different. If you couldn't bathe at home, and again most people couldn't, you'd have to rely on public bathhouses. These offered large communal tubs known as slipper baths, where you could soak for a penny. The water might not have been the cleanest by the time it was your turn to climb in, but it was still considered a rare treat. A proper soak was almost a luxury for the average person. However, the public bathhouses weren't necessarily accessible to everyone. Imagine being crammed into a poverty-stricken area in London without the means to travel even a few streets away for such a small indulgence. For some families, even a penny was better spent elsewhere. And if you couldn't afford bathhouses, you simply went without. If you had penny weren't spent, the documents already owe no notice. And in more modest households, there was sometimes a small tub used for bathing, but even then, heating enough water for a full bath took so much effort that families often shared bathwater. The father of the house would bathe first, then the mother, and so on down the line, with the youngest child getting the most questionable bath of all. By then, the water was less a thing of cleanliness and more, let's call it broth. So, while a weekly bath might sound romantic in theory, in practice, it was often far from refreshing. There were those, of course, who wanted to stay clean in other ways. Sponge baths became an essential routine for maintaining at least a baseline of hygiene. Using a flannel cloth, you dab at areas most prone to grime or sweat. This method may not have left you feeling sparkling fresh, but it was better than nothing. Perfumes and scented oils were also popular, especially among women, who often used them as both a personal luxury and a tool to mask unpleasant odors. After all, if you couldn't eliminate the smell of your surroundings, you could at least try to cover it up with the scent of lavender or rose. In So Questions of Liss, In Watching Out, In Watching Combined, and Marcus. Then there were the practical challenges of bathing as winter approached. London winters could be bitterly cold and drafty, and the thought of stripping down for a full body wash in a poorly insulated home with no central heating must have been, well, unappealing at best. The process of boiling water, hauling it into the room, and then bathing in a freezing space would have discouraged all but the bravest souls from doing it too often. Instead, sponge washing and piling on multiple layers of clothing became the go-to alternatives for getting through the colder months. Interestingly, the Victorians didn't see their bathing habits as particularly gross. In fact, cleanliness, or the appearance of it, was becoming tied to morality and social status. The cleaner you were, or appeared to be, the better people thought of you. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was about respectability. For the wealthier classes, this pressure translated into daily routines of grooming with fancy soaps and fragrant lotions. But even working class individuals were expected to keep up appearances as best they could. This created a divide where cleanliness became a marker of both wealth and morality. If you looked clean, it was assumed you were not just better off, but also a better person, more disciplined and more virtuous. What's fascinating is how this pressure played out in practice. Employers might set aside time for their workers to clean up before starting their day, and schools sometimes required students to arrive freshly washed. At the same time, charity initiatives often focused on improving bathing facilities for the poor, not necessarily as acts of pure kindness, but as efforts to civilize them. For example, some philanthropic groups funded the construction of more public bathhouses, allowing the working class access to proper facilities for a small fee. Cleanliness wasn't just about hygiene. It was used as a tool to reinforce social order and distinguish the respectable from the unruly. Even so, these advancements were unevenly distributed, and many families continued their old ways of managing baths at home, or skipping them when needed. If you think about it, the challenges were everywhere, no matter how much money you had. From the poor families sharing that one grimy tub of bath water, to the wealthy households that needed an entire team of staff just to arrange their twice-weekly soaks. Bathing, for what it was worth, wasn't an everyday luxury. It was an event, something you prepared for in advance, and something that carried physical and cultural weight far beyond what we might imagine today. As we've seen, the effort, money, and time needed to maintain personal hygiene often mirrored the social inequalities of the period. For the wealthy, cleanliness meant rosewater basins and perfumed soaps that demonstrated their refined tastes. For the poor, it was a copper tub in the kitchen, with each family member taking a turn and making do with the limits they had. What's clear is that bathing, more than just a physical act, became a way of showing who you were in society. The cleaner, the better, but only if you could afford it. Still, personal hygiene was about more than just baths. Every detail, from your teeth to your hair, came with its own unique challenges, and as many Victorians discovered,
Solutions didn't come easy. Let's take a look at how grooming added its own set of hurdles to the daily battle for cleanliness. Tooth powder, hair tonics, and corsets. What did Victorians use for toothpaste? Surprise, it wasn't minty. If you were trying to keep your teeth even halfway clean in the 19th century, you probably reached for tooth powder. But unlike the fresh-tasting gels we're used to today, this was often a weird, gritty mix of whatever was cheap and available. That could mean powdered chalk, charcoal, or yes, ground-up cuttlefish bone. Some versions included baking soda, which was at least somewhat effective at scrubbing away stains, but others relied on more questionable ingredients. Households typically made their own, and there wasn't much concern for how abrasive these powders might be on enamel. The goal wasn't really dental health as we think of it today, it was to brighten your smile and maybe freshen your breath a little. If you couldn't afford tooth powder though, some people just chewed on sticks of celery. Not exactly state-of-the-art. And dental hygiene didn't stop there. Toothbrushes existed but were expensive, especially for working-class families. Assuming you could get your hands on one, it probably wouldn't have been very effective anyway. Bristles were made from animal hair, which had a nasty habit of falling out or rotting if not dried properly. For most people, it was simpler and cheaper to use a rough cloth to wipe their teeth clean. And forget about routine trips to the dentist. Those were reserved strictly for emergencies, like pulling a decayed tooth when the pain became unbearable. Dental innovation as we know it was still a long time away. Hair care, meanwhile, wasn't much easier. Washing your hair was often a once-a-month ordeal. Why? Washing required water, and water required time, effort, and sometimes even help to heat and carry to the proper spot. But hair still needed to look good, and for women especially, their hair was considered their crowning glory, so attention to it was non-negotiable.
women turned to whatever they had on hand to keep their hair relatively clean and manageable. Sometimes that meant washing with rosemary or black tea to freshen up the scalp, or cracking a few eggs over their heads to condition their hair. Vinegar rinses were common too. After washing, oils or pomades were smoothed over the hair to tame flyaways and add sheen, though these products had their downsides. They were often animal fat-based, meaning they could go rancid over time. Imagine walking around with the unpleasant whiff of what some described as rancid fat clinging to your hair. Still, maintaining a polished appearance mattered. For women trying to manage long, elaborate hairstyles, keeping their hair styled for weeks at a time wasn't unusual. And not just because a full wash was.
Many women relied on elaborate arrangements of pins or even padding to bulk up their hair without actually needing more of it. If you were wealthy, you might experiment with more exotic ingredients like rum or rosemary oil, trying to give your hair that just clean shine without risking too much scrubbing. Men had their own grooming challenges. Shaving, for instance, wasn't the quick and easy task it is today. You wouldn't reach for a disposable razor. Instead, you had a straight razor, which was, let's face it, more weapon than tool. Shaving required serious attention, and more than a few men likely nicked themselves badly enough to swear off the whole process. Because of this, mustaches and beards became incredibly popular. Not only were they a way to skip some of the hassle of shaving, but facial hair also acted as a sort of low-maintenance style statement. Of course, beards and mustaches had their own set of problems, especially when they ended up trapping food particles or tobacco residue. Keeping them clean and well-groomed could take considerable effort, but hey, it beat risking a nasty cut with a razor first thing in the morning. Despite the difficulties, grooming didn't always mean going totally without help. Over time, innovations like safety razors became more accessible thanks to manufacturers claiming they were both easier and safer than wielding a straight edge. For hair, perfumed pomades helped cover up the less than fresh-smelling oils most people use for styling. While these products were more common among the wealthier classes, even working-class Victorians strove to maintain a sense of cleanliness and respectability wherever possible. Cleanliness, after all, was fast becoming a marker of morality, not just health. For women, grooming extended far beyond hair care. Corsets, for example, were a daily staple in a proper Victorian wardrobe, but they came with a steep price, a physical one. While they cinched the waist and created the desired hourglass figure, they also trapped heat and sweat beneath their tight fabric. Over time, layers of clothing, including petticoats and bustles, absorbed everything from perspiration to street grime, leaving women battling strongly unpleasant odors. But removing and washing those clothes regularly wasn't always a practical option. Instead, women turned to perfumes and scented powders to mask the smells, layering these on in an attempt to stay presentable. The effects were temporary, but in a society that demanded women look immaculate, it was better than nothing. Speaking of staying presentable, Victorian makeup brought its own complications. Lead-based face powders were popular for achieving that pale, delicate complexion that was all the rage, despite the fact that they were poisonous. Mercury-containing rouge added a pop of color to cheeks, but at a cost. Continuous use resulted in health problems ranging from rashes to, in some cases, fatal poisoning. Dyeing hair carried similar risks. Some dyes contained lead or other toxic chemicals, which meant that achieving the perfect shade could endanger your health without you even realizing it. And then there was the issue of menstrual hygiene, which Victorian women approached with a mix of ingenuity and necessity. The first disposable products were introduced in the late 1800s, but they weren't exactly convenient. Early pads were bulky and fastened to belts worn around the waist, not something you could discreetly slip into a handbag. Many women stuck to the old-fashioned option, rags. These were exactly what they sound like, strips of cloth that could be washed and reused. Practical, sure, but washing them became just another chore in an already long list. It's worth noting that sanitary products at the time weren't just about functionality. Like other grooming habits, they were discreetly marketed in ways that shamed women into feeling they needed to meet the unattainable cleanliness standards set by society. Even the wealthiest Victorians, despite their access to better products, weren't immune to the same underlying problems.
Their cosmetic and grooming routines might have included more luxurious ingredients and services, but they operated within the same framework of understanding or misunderstanding about hygiene. For example, wealthy women used raw meat as face masks to refresh their skin, a practice that sounds more medieval than modern. Combine that with rancid, pomade-coated hair, heavy perfumes, and powdered lead makeup, and the smell in a high society Victorian bedroom must have been downright intense. Ironically, all of these efforts, performed in the name of beauty and cleanliness, often left people in worse shape than when they started. Despite all this, there's something impressive about how Victorians adapted. The efforts they went to, however flawed or unpleasant, were rooted in a real desire to maintain dignity and appearance in conditions stacked against them. Even as they struggled with limited resources and poor understanding of health, they created routines that allowed them to present themselves as clean and respectable. Perfumed pomades, tooth-cleaning cloths, safety razors, and reused rags all speak to a kind of resilience, even if we wince at some of their methods now. But while individuals found ways to tackle personal hygiene, the city they lived in posed problems far bigger than what any amount of grooming could solve. Disease, death, and desperation came to a boiling point in London's streets, but nothing forced the issue more than the cholera outbreaks that devastated the city. That's where we're heading next. The cholera outbreaks that shook the city. What happens when your drinking water is laced with human waste? Well, if you were living in Victorian London, the answer was often cholera. The city was no stranger to outbreaks of this terrifying disease, and when it struck, it didn't just creep, it hit, fast and brutal.
Families saw loved ones drop ill overnight. It started with diarrhea, but before long, victims were curled up in pain, dehydrated to the point they barely looked human. Skin turned an eerie bluish grey, their bodies unable to absorb fluids. It was so aggressive people could go from perfectly fine to dead in less than a day. At first, nobody really understood what was happening. People assumed cholera floated through the thick, foul-smelling air, yet another catastrophe pinned on the miasma theory. And honestly, given the stench of London in the mid-1800s, it probably seemed like a safe bet. When the air reeks of rotting waste and sewage, you figure it has to be harmful, right? So the response was all about clearing smells, not solving the real problem. Streets were sprayed with lime or vinegar in an attempt to purify the air, and people stocked up on strongly scented herbs, hoping the aroma would act like a shield from the invisible killer. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Doctors, caught in this fog of misinformation, tried almost everything, or at least everything that didn't work. Some burned sulfur or tar in the hope that the smoke would purify homes. Others resorted to heavy doses of opium, not to treat the disease, but to ease the torturous pain. Alcohol was another common cure-all, prescribed in alarming amounts. None of it made a difference. Cholera continued to shred through entire neighbourhoods, leaving panic in its wake. Public officials, meanwhile, were stuck in a cycle of helplessness. They scrambled to respond, but no matter how much they tinkered or theorised, the death toll climbed. If you were poor, this nightmare was even worse. The overcrowded, crumbling tenements where the city's poorest residents lived created the perfect breeding grounds for outbreaks. Imagine 5 families crammed under one roof, sharing a single privy. Waste leaked into small water sources or seeped into wells used for drinking. It wasn't pretty, but there weren't other options. These were the places cholera hit hardest, and for the working class, it felt like there was no escape. The disease itself didn't discriminate. It could touch the rich just as easily as the poor, but in practice it was the most vulnerable who suffered the most. Enter Dr. John Snow. If you've heard his name in passing, you probably know him as the guy who figured out cholera came from water. But what you might not know is just how much resistance he faced. Snow wasn't a household name in his time. He was just a well-trained physician who had started questioning the status quo. Based on his observations, he noticed cholera didn't spread randomly, the way a disease carried by foul air should. Instead, it seemed more common in places where people drank from certain water supplies.
He believed the problem wasn't what people were breathing, but what they were swallowing. One of Snow's most famous investigations happened during a particularly nasty cholera outbreak in 1854.
A cluster of cases centred around households served by the Broad Street pump, a popular local water source.
Snow went door to door, gathering data about how and where the sick had gotten their water. His suspicions were confirmed. Nearly every family affected by the disease had used the pump. Snow urged officials to remove its handle, effectively cutting off access, and the results spoke for themselves. Once the pump was disabled, the outbreak slowed dramatically. You'd think the evidence was undeniable, right? But public opinion didn't change overnight. Snow's findings directly contradicted the deeply entrenched miasma theory that linked disease to bad smells. His theory, that invisible germs in the water were what made people dangerously sick, required a massive leap in understanding. Many dismissed him outright. Some argued the timing of the pump closure and the decline in cases was just coincidence. Meanwhile, they kept focusing on plans to improve air quality, as though freshly perfumed streets would do anything to protect the people still drinking from filthy wells. Snow also didn't fully understand what we now know about bacteria. Germ theory, the idea that microorganisms caused illnesses, hadn't gained enough traction yet. So, while Snow's observations were correct, the larger medical community wasn't ready to accept findings that went beyond their most trusted explanations. The truth wouldn't gain widespread acceptance until much later, long after cholera had already claimed thousands of lives. Cholera outbreaks came and went, carrying death through the streets. But if one event finally shook the city into action, it was the Great Stink of 1858. By then, the Thames wasn't just a gently flowing river, it was a literal sewer, choked with human and industrial waste. A summer heatwave turned it into a steaming, reeking mess that hung over the city, smothering the air and making daily life unbearable. Even Parliament, which sat near the river, couldn't escape. Debates were cut short as members fled the choking stench, most of them realising for the first time just how dire the city's sanitation problem had become. The stink wasn't just something you could power through, it was impossible to ignore. By this point, Jon Snow's legacy had been building momentum, even though he didn't live to see its full impact. His work on the Broad Street pump, coupled with mounting pressure from the public, became impossible to ignore. The city's leaders finally conceded that something had to change. London's sanitation crisis was no longer just a nuisance. It was a city-wide disaster that demanded a solution. This is where engineer Joseph Bazalgette made his mark. Tasked with redesigning London's sewer system, he devised an ambitious plan to move waste far out of the city and away from the Thames. It was the kind of project that seemed impossible at the time. Thousands of miles of new tunnels, enormous financial investment, and years of labour.
But it was all connected. Cholera, waste, clean water, even the dreaded bad air. Bazalgette's work proved once and for all that tackling the real sources of filth could save lives. Yet, even as the sewers improved sanitation, habits didn't change right away. Old routines, dumping waste into streets or directly into nearby water sources, continued for years, especially in poorer neighbourhoods that weren't immediately connected to the expanded system. This created a frustrating lag, where cholera outbreaks declined in some areas but still resurfaced in others. Cleaning up London wasn't a one-and-done fix. It required a generation of gradual change in both knowledge and behaviour. But the payoff? It was undeniable. As sanitation improved and the link between clean water and health became clearer, cholera all but disappeared from the city. Snow, who had been dismissed during his lifetime, became a posthumous hero. Over time, his waterborne theory became the foundation for understanding how diseases like cholera spread and how they could be stopped. The cholera outbreaks in London were devastating. They tore families apart, stoked fear, and exposed just how unprepared the city was to care for its most vulnerable people. But those horrors did more than destroy.
They forced change. The crises pushed scientific understanding, hastened infrastructure improvements, and ultimately created a healthier, safer city. The Great Stink may have been the turning point, but it was cholera's relentless assault that brought London to the brink and beyond. By the late 19th century, public health reforms had started to reshape the way people viewed sanitation. Improvements in waste disposal, better water treatment, and yes, even understanding the value of soap all began to raise the standard of living. But that summer of 1858, when even lawmakers had to flee the unbearable stink, marked the moment the city's leaders realized they couldn't afford to look away any longer. Of course, the legacy of cholera isn't just about London's sewers. It's about the connection between the visible and the invisible, about realizing that sometimes what you can't see is what kills you. The stench that drove people from their homes was finally a wake-up call, not just for London, but for cities worldwide. And it was only the beginning. Next, we're diving deeper into the Great Stink itself, when the Thames reached its foulest breaking point. Stay with me. The Great Stink of 1858. Imagine it's the summer of 1858 in London. The air is heavy with heat, and the familiar stench of the Thames has gone from unpleasant to something far worse. You step outside and the smell doesn't just linger at the edge of awareness, it takes over. It sticks in your throat, it settles on your skin, it makes every breath feel like swallowing a mouthful of filth. Thanks to weeks of high temperatures, the water levels have dropped and exposed the layers of sewage lurking underneath. The heat has caused it to ferment, releasing a thick, putrid odour that soaks into every corner of the city. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a full-blown crisis. The kind of moment history would later call the Great Stink. Now imagine walking by the Thames. What was once brownish water now looks and acts like sludge. It doesn't flow as much as it clogs, carrying chunks of waste and filth along its surface. Flies swarm over the banks, drawn by the rotting carcasses of animals tossed carelessly into the river to be disposed of. The smell, described by anyone unfortunate enough to be near it, was unbearable. It didn't help that raw sewage had been pouring into the Thames for years, so this heat wave was really nature's last straw. The river finally turned on the city, and not even its most powerful residents could escape. Take the Houses of Parliament, perched right on the edge of the Thames. You'd think the walls of one of London's most important buildings might offer some protection, but no. With the windows open for ventilation, and yes, that was the only way to cool things down, the noxious fumes rolled straight inside, filling the chambers and overwhelming anyone brave enough to stay. Lawmakers gagged, using scented handkerchiefs to cover their noses, their faces twisted in discomfort. It got so bad they went into full panic mode, debating whether Parliament itself might need to temporarily relocate because the stench made it impossible to work. Think about that for a moment. A brand new, state-of-the-art building, abandoned not because it was unsafe or unfinished, but because the stink was so powerful that even seasoned politicians couldn't handle it. And it wasn't just Parliament. Businesses close to the river shut their doors. Work slowed to a crawl as people fled whenever they could, desperate to escape the suffocating air. For those who lived in riverside homes, mostly poorer families, there was no getting away. The smell permeated everything from their clothes to their food. Without modern ventilation or air filtration, closing a window offered no relief. The heat only trapped the stink indoors, turning every room into a space where breathing felt like punishment. Even houses farther from the river weren't entirely safe, thanks to how winds carried the smell deep into the city. As Londoners wrestled with whether to vomit, cry, or just give up, the newspapers had a field day. The Great Stink, they called it, and rightly so. Columns captured the mood of the city with vivid descriptions of the horror. Charles Dickens, always good for a cutting observation, wrote that the Thames had become a deadly sewer in the place of a fine, fresh river. Another popular image from the time?
Scientists reportedly dropped white pieces of paper into the water, only to watch them vanish instantly into the brown, soupy mess. It's unsettling to imagine just how polluted the river had become, but for the millions of Londoners living their lives around it, this was a stark, inescapable reality. The city, of course, didn't get here overnight. The Thames had been abused for decades, with little thought to its limits. In Victorian London, the river pulled double duty as both a source of water and a giant garbage disposal. Everyone, from factories to individual households, had been dumping into the river long before the summer of 1858 arrived. Human waste ran directly into it, untreated and unbothered, while industry piled in everything from chemicals to animal byproducts. The heatwave just made it impossible to pretend this wasn't a crisis anymore. Now here's the frustrating part. This disaster didn't come out of nowhere. People had been complaining about the condition of the Thames for years, yet the government seemed unwilling or unable to act. Even as the water grew more polluted and cholera outbreaks devastated the city, officials dragged their feet. The prevailing theory, of course, was still miasma, the belief that bad smells alone caused disease. So rather than tackling the source of the problem by figuring out, say, how to clean the water, the focus stayed on trying to clear the air instead. When you think about it, this made everything worse. Instead of dealing with the underlying problem, the government kept looking for ways to mask it, hoping maybe the smell would just magically go away. But this time, the stink didn't just inconvenience ordinary Londoners. It disrupted Parliament itself, forcing politicians to confront the severity of the issue. Imagine a room full of lawmakers, retching into their sleeves and debating whether to spend even one more minute in the building. That's how bad things got. Some members, it was reported, fled altogether, finding excuses to leave so they wouldn't have to sit through the ordeal. Others complained loudly but stuck it out, grimacing through every humiliating whiff. All of this chaos would probably still have gone nowhere if not for two factors: public pressure and one ambitious engineer. Momentum was growing from ordinary citizens who were fed up with living in filth, falling ill, and being ignored. But what everyone shared that summer, even London's wealthiest neighbourhoods, was that overpowering stink. No money could protect you from it, no matter how far from the Thames you lived. Suddenly, solving the city's sanitation problem wasn't just about helping the poor or managing outbreaks. It was about giving everyone, Parliament included, some relief. And that's where Joseph Bazalgette truly enters history. He wasn't the first to suggest cleaning up the Thames, but he was the one who knew how to make it happen. Bazalgette, an engineer, already had ideas for a massive sewer system that could transform how London dealt with waste. The goals were straightforward: get sewage out of the city and into areas where it could be safely processed and managed, far from the water used by Londoners every day. But the scale of this project was enormous. We're talking thousands of miles of tunnels and pipes, the kind of undertaking most people barely believed was possible. Bazalgette pitched his plan as a practical, long-term solution, and this time urgency was on his side. The Great Stink had essentially backed Parliament into a corner. Lawmakers suddenly saw no other option. It wasn't just a public health measure, it was political survival. The money and resources Bazalgette needed were finally approved, and construction began on what would become one of the most important engineering projects in London's history. Of course, actually building this sewer system was a monumental task on its own, filled with challenges and setbacks. And even with the best designs in the world, the project was just the start. Fixing London's sanitation crisis wouldn't happen overnight, and convincing the public to change their habits, after generations of using the river as a giant toilet, wasn't easy. But for that moment, during the summer of 1858, the Great Stink was undeniable proof that the city couldn't continue as it had been. The stink had humiliated the government, forced public attention, and finally set the wheels of change in motion. It was a breaking point not just for the Thames, but for how Victorian London approached public health. And while Bazalgette and his team worked to dig out thousands of tons of waste and lay down new sewer systems, the city continued its day-to-day life. The stink lingered for years in memory,
a reminder not just of how bad things had been, but how desperate people were for a solution. But the effort was far from over. Building the sewers required grit, determination, and a whole lot of elbow grease. And as you'll see, what happened underground would define the future of London itself. Let's head there now. Building the sewers that saved London. How do you dig over 1,000 miles of sewer tunnels under a city without bulldozers, electric drills, or so much as a flashlight? You start with a plan so ambitious most people think it sounds impossible. That's exactly what Joseph Bazalgette faced in 1858 when he took on the task of saving London from drowning in its own filth. Bazalgette wasn't interested in patchwork fixes. His vision was comprehensive, a complete overhaul of the city's sanitation system. But the scale of the challenge was staggering. He wasn't just dealing with a city, he was dealing with a beast of waste, water, and growth that had been neglected for far too long. And he had to tame it. His plan? Build a sprawling underground sewer network that would permanently reroute human waste, industrial runoff, and street filth far away from where people lived. It was a bold move, and not just because of the sheer size of the project, it was also because the engineering behind it pushed the limits of what anyone thought could be done at the time. Over 1,000 miles of sewers would run beneath the streets of London, connecting to large intercepting sewers. These intercepting sewers work like highways, carrying everything downstream to treatment stations well outside the city. The idea was simple: get the waste out of the city's drinking water and out of sight, permanently. But turning that idea into a reality, that was a whole different story. The first obstacle was London itself, a city that had been built and rebuilt over centuries, navigating its chaotic, crisscrossing streets, digging under existing buildings, and creating tunnels stable enough to keep from collapsing. This wasn't a job you could lay out on a clean blueprint. Some neighbourhoods had to be completely demolished to make room for Bazalgette's vision, displacing thousands of families in the process. Imagine being told your home was coming down so a sewer could take its place, all while you lived in conditions where clean water was already a distant dream. The disruption was enormous, and it wasn't just residential areas. Parts of the city's streets and infrastructure had to be ripped open to accommodate the work, creating a constant churn of construction. For many Londoners, the sound of carts and the clatter of tools became part of everyday life. Then came another challenge. London isn't flat. The city's rolling terrain made it impossible to rely on gravity alone to move the waste out of the city, so Bazalgette's team built massive pumping stations, industrial marvels of the Victorian era, to lift sewage uphill when necessary. These pumping stations weren't just practical, they were cathedrals of engineering, with elaborate designs that made them look more like grand monuments than functional facilities. Inside, steam-powered machinery roared to life, pumping waste up so it could continue its journey through the network. Without these stations, the system simply wouldn't have worked. The sewers themselves were crafted with remarkable precision. Bazalgette insisted they be built far larger than what was strictly necessary for the population at the time. Why? He predicted that London would keep growing, and he wanted the system to last generations. The brick-lined tunnels were designed to be both durable and self-cleaning. They sloped just enough so that waste could flow smoothly, but not get stuck. An ingenious balance of engineering and practicality. And while the materials and methods available in the 19th century seem primitive by today's standards, Bazalgette spared no detail. The design was so robust that parts of his system are still in use today. Of course, all of this came with an enormous price tag. In today's money, the cost of the project would have been in the billions.
This wasn't money the city had lying around, so the government had to raise taxes, issue bonds, and borrow from banks to cover it. Unsurprisingly, many Londoners weren't thrilled about footing the bill for a project they didn't fully understand. People grumbled about the expense, accusing the government of wasting money on an extravagant plan. After all, the connection between sanitation and health still wasn't clear to everyone. Many doubted whether the sewers would make a difference at all. But Bazalgette pushed forward, supported by a growing awareness, thanks to earlier cholera outbreaks, that the cost of doing nothing was far greater. Building the sewers required an army of workers. Often they worked terrible hours in awful conditions, buried in mud, dust, and sometimes sewage. The smell, still very much part of the job, was nauseating, and the work was dangerous. There were no hard hats or safety protocols as we know them. Workers carved tunnels in the dark using picks and shovels, pushing through soil that could collapse at any moment. Injuries were common, and the pay barely compensated for the risks involved. But without this unrelenting labour, the project would never have gotten off the ground. Over time, these workers became unlikely heroes, the unseen hands that built an underground world that would save millions of lives. As the sewers neared completion, attention turned to the Thames. Bazalgette's design included a clever addition: embankments along the river. These weren't just there to tidy the riverbanks, they acted as structural support for the new sewers. Building the embankments provided extra land for cleaner streets and roads, while also containing the flow of runoff that might otherwise pour back into the water. The work wasn't glamorous, but it transformed London's relationship with its river. For the first time in decades, the Thames began to run cleaner, or at least less visibly polluted. Once the system was up and running, the effects were immediate and undeniable. Disease rates plummeted. Outbreaks of cholera, which once tore through the city with horrifying regularity, became far less common. For thousands of families, life in London finally felt livable. You could walk along the river without gagging. Entire neighbourhoods that had once been completely unbearable found new life. Even skeptics had to admit that the sewers were more than a success. They were what had kept the city from collapsing under the weight of its own waste. But like all monumental projects, the sewer system wasn't without its flaws. Raw sewage still ended up in the Thames, just further downstream, trading one problem for another. The pumping stations, while impressive, occasionally broke down, causing temporary failures in the system. And of course, as with much of Victorian progress, the wealthiest areas benefited first. Poorer neighbourhoods waited years to be connected to the full network, leaving some families stuck with old cesspits and contaminated wells, despite the city's advances. Still, the big picture was astonishing. London had gone from one of the dirtiest cities in the world to a model for modern sanitation. Even beyond the immediate improvements in public health, Bazalgette's sewers set the stage for further urban reforms. People started demanding cleaner streets, better housing, and safer work environments. The city was no longer just tolerating filth, it was learning to expect better. And here's the thing, a healthier city also became a more productive city. With less disease, families had the chance to work, recover, and build better lives. Bazalgette's work created a ripple effect that transformed London far beyond its tunnels and pipes. Today, Bazalgette's sewer system is celebrated as an engineering marvel, but back then it was a lifeline. His vision and the sheer effort it took to carry it out proved that even the dirtiest, most dysfunctional cities could change with enough determination. The project didn't just save London, it became the blueprint for how cities around the world could organise themselves in an age of rapid growth and industrialisation. The sewers weren't the end of Victorian innovation, though. As sanitation improved, so did the push for other advancements in public health, housing, and overall cleanliness. Londoners were finally starting to experience a city where clean water, fresh air, and safer streets weren't unattainable luxuries, they were becoming the standard. And while Bazalgette's work changed the underground world of London, a new wave of progress was about to transform what happened above ground too. Let's move forward. The 1875 Public Health Act and beyond. What finally made clean water and sanitation a right instead of a privilege? It all started with the 1875 Public Health Act. If Victorian London had one defining issue, it was this: life itself was dangerous. Outbreaks of cholera and typhoid, overcrowded housing, sewage-filled streets, these weren't just inconveniences, they were constants. By the time this act rolled around, the government had no choice but to intervene. It was time to stop pretending the problem would fix itself. The Act was a game changer. For the first time, local councils were given real power to enforce sanitation rules, something that might have seemed revolutionary for its time. They were tasked with handling waste, improving housing, and ensuring people had access to clean water.
These weren't suggestions, they were legal requirements. It was the first acknowledgement that it wasn't enough to expect individuals to manage public health on their own. The city, the government, had to step in. But here's the thing, not everyone was thrilled about these reforms. For landlords, the new rules were downright irritating.
They were now responsible for maintaining their properties to meet basic sanitary standards. That meant staying on top of repairs, making sure tenants had access to cesspools that were regularly emptied, and, in time, upgrading their buildings to include plumbing. And, surprise, surprise, the people who had been raking in rent money without lifting a finger to maintain those packed tenements weren't eager to start spending cash on improvements. Many of them fought the regulations tooth and nail. Businesses weren't any happier. The rules also targeted factories and workshops, making it clear they could no longer dump waste wherever they wanted. Suddenly, they had to find proper systems for disposal, which wasn't cheap. Companies argued these new costs would kill their profits, and they complained loudly about overreach. After all, they were used to operating however they liked. Public health was someone else's problem, or so they thought. Even Bazalgette's sewer network, while operational by 1875, could only do so much when private waste kept pouring in unchecked. The government had to enforce the act at every level, one stubborn business or landlord at a time, and that slowed progress. Then there was the question of infrastructure. The idea of clean water for everyone sounded great on paper, sure, but the reality of delivering that promise was another story. Take indoor plumbing, something we take for granted today. At the time, having running water in your home was a dream for most people. Wealthy homes started adding plumbing first, of course, because they could afford it. But for working-class families in crowded slums, plumbing was a slow, gradual upgrade, and some lived their entire lives without seeing a single faucet installed in their homes. Public bathhouses and water pumps remained the norm for these communities, which meant hygiene still involved carry-your-own-water routines well into the 20th century. But attitudes were shifting. People weren't just hearing about public health in abstracts anymore. They were living it. By the late 19th century, it was becoming harder to ignore that cleanliness wasn't some upper-class eccentricity. It actually saved lives. As cities began enforcing waste collection and managing clean water, disease outbreaks started declining. Seeing cholera recede wasn't just comforting, it was a wake-up call. Maybe all this talk about sanitation wasn't so unrealistic after all. Still, it took education and time to get people fully on board. Think about how deeply ingrained some Victorian habits were. For generations, people believed what mattered most was avoiding bad smells. The idea that tiny, invisible germs could kill you, that didn't sink in overnight. Even as the Public Health Act was reshaping cities, the germ theory of disease hadn't entirely caught on yet. For many, personal hygiene still revolved around perfumes and powders, not necessarily scrubbing away bacteria. And yet the long-term impact of the act was massive. This legislation made sanitation an unshakable priority. By addressing water quality, housing, and waste disposal in one sweeping effort, it laid the groundwork for more modern systems of public health. Later laws and reforms built on its backbone, like policies on food safety, disease prevention, and better workplace standards. It wasn't about short-term fixes, it was about building an entirely different baseline for society. It meant that clean water wasn't something reserved for the wealthiest. Eventually, even the poorest parts of London started seeing improvements, though to be fair, eventually is doing a lot of work there. Poor neighbourhoods were always the last to benefit. If you lived in a rundown tenement, you might not see significant changes for years after wealthier areas were already reaping the benefits of clean plumbing and organised waste services. Wealth disparity aside, the reform ignited real change. The Act didn't just improve conditions, it reshaped how people thought about a city's responsibilities. Before this point, urban life was often treated as a free-for-all. Overcrowding was a problem for the poor to sort out, and pollution was just part of living in an industrialised world. The Public Health Act rejected that idea completely. It acknowledged for the first time that government had an active role in safeguarding the environment people lived in. That recognition, that shift from blaming individuals to addressing systemic problems, was revolutionary for its time. But that doesn't mean the Public Health Act was perfect.
Enforcement varied wildly depending on the borough or city handling it. In wealthier areas with organised councils, progress came quickly. Resources were there, and officials could afford to focus on their long-term goals. But in poorer districts, corruption and financial strains created massive delays. Some landlords exploited legal loopholes to delay upgrades, and industrialists with deep pockets stalled reforms with relentless court battles. The uneven rollout of improvements fed into existing inequalities, leaving some neighbourhoods stuck in near-Victorian conditions, even as other parts of the city modernised. Despite the roadblocks, the Act's influence continued to show. Indoor plumbing, once a mark of luxury, gradually became the expected standard for housing over the following decades. Waste controls grew increasingly strict, regulating what could and couldn't be dumped into rivers or sewers, and the link between sanitation and public health began cementing itself into the public consciousness. People weren't just washing their hands or scrubbing their floors because it made them look respectable. They did it because it worked. The legacy of the 1875 Public Health Act stretched far beyond Victorian England. It became a model for urban reform internationally, with other cities borrowing its principles to manage their own crises of pollution
and disease.
For Londoners, though, the changes hit a little closer to home. Imagine growing up in a dead-end street with overflowing privies, only to see garbage trucks and clean water pipes installed within your lifetime. For many, the Act represented hope, a visible shift from survival to something resembling dignity. By the 20th century, reforms like these had transformed London. Disease outbreaks became less frequent and life expectancy began to rise. Public attitudes toward hygiene underwent their own mini-revolution as the importance of sanitation found its way into schools, factories, and public spaces. Cleanliness wasn't just a moral virtue, it was practical, achievable, and fundamental to city living. The Act wasn't a magic wand for inequality, of course, but it was a start. Rich or poor, every Londoner deserved the basic right of clean water and habitable homes. And while the Act didn't erase those disparities, it began to close the worst gaps. Within a few decades, the idea that sanitation wasn't negotiable became ingrained. Whether you were living in a sprawling mansion or a tiny flat, access to clean water was something you could count on, or at least demand. Even so, laws could only change so much. The rest came down to the people applying them and the habits of the everyday citizen. The shift toward cleaner living wasn't just about reorganizing cities, it was about reshaping how people viewed their spaces, their practices, and their priorities. And as 19th century London began moving into the modern age, these attitudes transformed everything from the design of homes to the way people thought about bathing, eating, and even dressing. For families who had spent generations struggling with toxic, disease-ridden conditions, these changes weren't abstract ideas. They were real, visible improvements in daily life. And even as Victorian discomfort lingered in some corners, it became clearer and clearer how far the city had come since the foul-smelling chaos of the mid-century. But while laws and expanding infrastructure remade the city, a quieter, more personal change was happening too. Individuals weren't just adapting to cleaner surroundings, they were rethinking the basics of personal hygiene itself in ways that would transform daily routines and leave a lasting legacy. Let's see how that took shape. From discomfort to modern hygiene. Imagine brushing your teeth, running warm water, or even flipping on a light switch without really thinking about it. These tiny automatic habits, things we couldn't imagine living without, are actually things Victorians would have looked at with pure envy. The truth is, modern hygiene as we know it was built on painfully slow changes during the 19th century. It didn't happen overnight. Instead, years of trial, error, and sometimes pure stubbornness transformed Victorian discomfort into what we now consider basic standards of daily life.
But the road to those comforts, it was long, messy, and anything but straightforward.
Let's start with the most obvious change, the availability of clean water. Before plumbing made its way into homes, and long before people understood germs, water was tied as much to death as it was to life. Drinking or bathing in it was essentially rolling the dice. But by the late 19th century, things were shifting. The sewer networks Joseph Bazalgette envisioned didn't just reroute waste, they laid the foundation for cleaner water systems. For the first time, water wasn't just about quenching thirst, it was about preventing sickness. Of course, this change didn't arrive fully packaged. Many neighborhoods weren't connected to modern sewer lines until decades later, particularly poorer ones. Still, step by step, the idea of clean water as something people deserved rather than a luxury began to stick. At the same time, soap was quietly revolutionizing hygiene on a personal level. In early Victorian London, it had been too expensive for the average family. One bar cost a significant portion of a weekly income for the working class. But as industrial manufacturing made soap cheaper, it started appearing in more homes. It wasn't just about being clean. Soap became a symbol of aspiration, something people viewed as a mark of respectability. For wealthier Victorians, it even became an art form, packaged in elaborate boxes and scented with lavender or rose. But the real game changer came when mass-produced, affordable soap reached working-class households. Suddenly, keeping your hands and household clean was no longer just a dream for people on tight incomes. It became achievable, even routine. There's also the quieter shift in medicine that completely reshaped how people thought about cleanliness. Antiseptic surgery was just starting to catch on in the late Victorian era, thanks to pioneers like Joseph Lister. Imagine stepping into a 19th century hospital before antiseptics. There was no sense of sterilization as we think of it today. Surgeons operated in regular coats and bare hands. Surgical instruments were cleaned when someone remembered. The result? Infection spread through operating rooms like wildfire. Lister challenged all that by promoting the use of carbolic acid to reduce germs during procedures. This not only slashed patient death rates, but rewired how doctors saw cleanliness as a whole. It wasn't cosmetic, it was life-saving. Over the years, hospitals adopted stricter sanitary practices, and the ripple effects of antiseptic surgery transformed not just medicine, but hygiene. This was a turning point. Victorian innovation directly saving lives on an unprecedented scale. But here's the thing. These changes, for instance, while people liked the idea of smelling nice, soap and water weren't always tied to health in people's minds. Clothes were worn until visibly filthy. People saw heavy washing as dangerous or unnecessary. After all, if bad smells were the problem, spritzing yourself with lavender water seemed like enough, right? Changing attitudes required time, education, and often trial by fire. In some cases, it took devastating cholera outbreaks or the tragedy of surgeries gone wrong to convince people that hygiene was worth prioritizing. Advancements in plumbing also met plenty of resistance. Installing piping in homes was no small feat. Think about how disruptive it must have been to rip apart your walls or floorboards to fit new pipes, especially for families living in cramped homes with very little space to begin with. At first, only the wealthiest could afford indoor plumbing, but as techniques improved and costs dropped, middle-class and eventually working-class households started joining the trend. Over time, indoor plumbing went from luxury to expectation. This meant no more hauling water from distant wells or baths, no more shared privies leaking into courtyards. It allowed Victorian residents to literally bring sanitation into their homes, and it's hard to understate just how transformative that was. That said, the process was often uneven. Renovations were expensive, and landlords in poorer areas still cut corners whenever they could. In many shabby tenements, it wasn't unusual to see outdated waste systems or homes still depending on communal water pumps long after neighbouring streets had been upgraded with indoor taps. These places became glaring reminders of just how much slower progress was for the working class. But across the decades, even the roughest parts of London started seeing improvements. a sign that public policy was finally catching up with ordinary people's needs. And even amidst all this slow progress, the emotional impact of change can't be ignored. Think about families who had spent generations dealing with daily grime, dodging disease and wrestling with the exhaustion of constant physical labor. Imagine coming home one day to running water in your kitchen, or discovering you didn't have to carry endless buckets to scrub your floors anymore. Whether they realized it or not, these tiny conveniences offered relief. Not just physical, but emotional. You weren't just cleaner, you were freer. It gave people hope, something many working-class families hadn't had much reason to feel in years. The transformation of hygiene in the Victorian era was about more than avoiding danger. It became about dignity. For the first time in generations, poor families could aspire to standards of living once reserved for the wealthy. Clean water, soap, and basic sanitation weren't status symbols. They were marks of survival, of having made it out of conditions that had once overwhelmed their parents and grandparents.
For children in these families, improved hygiene meant something even bigger. They were healthier, growing stronger, and importantly, living longer. The child mortality rate that once cast a shadow over Victorian life began to drop. People could start imagining futures in ways that didn't seem possible before. And what's interesting is how hygiene and health improvements created opportunities for even greater change. When people were no longer worn down by constant illness, they had more energy and more time. Productivity increased, cities became livelier. A healthier population fueled everything from better schooling to industrial growth, creating a feedback loop of progress. Over time, the positive effects stacked in ways the Victorians probably couldn't have predicted. So how do we link this back to today? That running water in your sink, the soap by your bathroom counter, the fact that you probably haven't thought too hard about where your wastewater goes, all of it connects back to Victorian innovation. Their struggle for cleaner streets, healthier homes, and longer lives wasn't just about them. It set the stage for every comfort we take for granted now. It wasn't just the Great Stink or the sewer system. It was the snowball effect of all those little steps forward, decade by decade. In the end, what makes the story of Victorian hygiene so powerful isn't just the scale of their challenges. It's the fact that they didn't give up. They fought through filth, through disease, through stubborn habits and resistance to progress, and they came out the other side with something better. Not perfect, not immediate, but better. And that's a lesson worth holding on to. Because when you think about it, the incremental changes they demanded, in public health, in cleanliness, in dignity, weren't just about the past. They resonate in every drop of clean water, every pump of liquid soap, and every chance we have to imagine a better standard of living for everyone, everywhere. In conclusion, it's wild to think that a city groaning under disease, filth, and that unforgettable stink could transform into a world leader in public health. The Victorians didn't have all the answers, but they had determination, and it saved millions of lives. So next time you turn on your tap or step into a steaming shower, take a second to appreciate just how far we've come. What might feel like life's smallest luxuries were, not so long ago, unimaginable for most. And here's something to sit with. What other struggles from history still shape the comforts we take for granted today?